I think these things have the potential to be money because I think that they are going to be the most widely owned fungible asset in the world. And that's why I think the winning like layer one platform, that token, is going to be the biggest winner in crypto, and it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar outcome. What got us originally interested in this thesis, this proof of physical work or decentralized physical infrastructure networks thesis, was that it was a new method of capital formation. The people who are saying Blockspace is empty, like why do we need to scale, are the people who in the 90s would have been saying like, why do you need more than dial-up?
Tushar, thank you so much. Really just excited to be doing a podcast with you. I respect what you and Kyle have built at Multicoin. And really, I think, as we were talking earlier, I respect that you guys are early and right. And I think, I mean, you just did a podcast with Empire. And I think, I mean, the definition of early and right is the alpha. And you guys are consistently right. And I think that is hard. And so I just massive kudos to you and Kyle for what you built at Multicoin. And
thank you.
Excited to be doing this podcast. And thank you for letting me do it in person. I really enjoy the in-person podcasts. I just think they're much better.
Yeah, I'm excited to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So maybe to kick it off, would love to learn a little bit more about how you think about MEV and valuing some of these layer ones. I think you gave a great talk at your summit. And so I would love to just maybe kick off the podcast there and speak a little bit to some of your thoughts around MEV and how you value these layer one assets.
Yeah, I'll go into 3 different components of how I think about it, but please interrupt me if you have questions on any of them. So I think you can value layer ones as a sum of the parts valuation. And I think there's 3 major parts that really matter. The first is commodity. Like these things are a commodity. The second is these things are a capital asset that produces income. And then the third is their money or a money type asset. So I'll go through them in that order.
Cool.
Right. I think the commodity one is pretty easy to understand for people in crypto. You need to have ETH or SOL or whatever other L1 token in order to pay gas, in order to use that network. That's kind of like needing oil to make your car go, or needing electricity to power your house. These are useful commodities, and a portion of them is burned when you use it.
Yeah.
Right. So you can pretty easily see how much is being issued of that layer one token. You can compare it to how much is being burned. And that ratio gives you the ability to derive like how much value is it getting from the commodity part of the valuation. And you can also project that forward and see, and discount it back. Then the second part, I think that's less well understood, is the capital asset portion. So what is a capital asset? A capital asset is something that you own that allows you to go make money, go make something. And the way that I think these L1 tokens are a capital asset is through something called MEV. So to explain like what MEV is, you have to think about how does the blockchain actually work? Mm-hmm. And if you are the leader for this block, you are God for the block. You decide what transactions go in and which ones don't. And you decide the order that those transactions are in. Maybe
I think I've seen, and you and Kyle have spoken to this as well, is like people try to mitigate MEV or eliminate, to remove it, kill it if possible. Can you speak, a little bit before even diving deeper into MEV, why it's not really possible to like remove it?
Yeah, because there's always going to be arbitrages that exist. Mm-hmm. You cannot eliminate those arbitrages. Like the price of XYZ asset on chain, let's say on a Solana DEX, is going to differ from that same asset's price on Coinbase or on an ETH DEX or something else at any given point in time. Because like, let's say you as a user show up, you go buy on one of those exchanges. Well, now the price is out of line with all the other ones. And someone has to bring that back in line.
Yeah.
And so you can try to like block that somehow and say, actually, what we'll do is we'll randomize the order of transactions within a block, or we'll do first come, first serve only, and we won't allow fees to dictate the order. But you're just like moving the avenue of competition from fees to something else. Right? Like if you do first come, first serve, like here we are in the HFT latency game again, where people are building microwave towers to get that 1 nanosecond faster between Chicago and New York.
Yep.
Right? Like, is that better? Like, I don't think so. Right? Or if you say we're going to randomize the order of transactions within the block, well, then I'm just going to spam you with 1 million transactions, and then one of them is going to hit at the point that I need it to, and the others will all fail. And I'm going to overload the chain. Right? And like that just creates perverse incentives and breaks everything. So I think actually the only sustainable and the only sustainable good equilibrium here is one where the MEV is effectively redistributed to the token holders who are staking their L1 token through transaction fees being paid to get your transaction in. So like an example would be if I want to run an ARB between Margin Fi and Drift on Solana, or on Sushi and Uni on Ethereum, and the prices are different. Well, if I know that I'm going to make $10 of profit, I will bid $9.90 in gas.
Yeah.
In order to be the one who gets that. And then if you're the validator, you're going to pick me because I'm paying the most. But that means that I get to make 10 cents and the stakers get to make $9.90. And that seems a lot better to me as an equilibrium than I invest that $9.90 in microwave towers that serve no other purpose.
That makes sense. Yeah. And then I think I cut you off. I apologize. You were talking also about the capital assets, and then I believe we didn't touch upon the third one as well.
Yeah. So to go back to the capital assets, right? Using this example that I gave, this $9.90 that ends up getting paid, like, well, if you can project forward how much MEV you think is going to be on that chain, then you can look at that almost as income that is going to stakers. Mm-hmm. So if you are staking, you're going to get, like, let's say you're staking, 10 bips of the total supply of the tokens. Well, on average, you should earn 10 bips of the MEV that's on that chain. So you can, do a discounted cash flow valuation, and that gives you that second component, that capital asset component of these L1s. And then the third component is these things are money. And I think these things have the potential to be money because I think that they are going to be the most widely owned fungible asset in the world.
Yeah.
The most number of people will own it, right? Like, take a guess. How many people do you think own equities? Like own like the S&P 500 or some equivalent index? On the order of?
Yeah, maybe 100 million.
Yeah, it's somewhere between like 200 to 400 are the best estimates, right? And fewer people own like fixed income. The biggest thing that most people have are like bank accounts or CDs, right? And I think that layer 1 tokens will surpass all of those.
Yeah.
And so more people will have a Sol or ETH or something like that in their wallet than have any other type of fungible asset.
Yeah.
And that is like a really interesting prereq to being like the future of money, because this thing is valuable as a commodity because you're using the products, like they're useful. That it's valuable as a capital asset because you're earning from staking it, and not just earning more of the same token, right? Like staking ETH to earn more ETH is more a redistribution of the ownership. It's not income.
Yeah.
But MEV is income. It's exogenous, right? And then also, that there's a billion other people who have this thing. So I think that gives it like a moneyness property. And that's why I think the winning like layer 1 platform, that token, is going to be the biggest winner in crypto. And it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar outcome.
I do agree. I think people underestimate how large some of these market caps of like layer 1s are going to be. definitely in the trillions. One aspect that I've gotten the question quite a bit on is Ethereum kind of focusing on this money aspect relatively, I would say, early in its life cycle compared to like users of the network. How do you think about maybe Ethereum, for example, versus, I mean, maybe even Solana specifically, kind of having a little bit higher inflation today, and how over time those two will play out?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because the question is like, what needs to come first?
Yes.
Right. I think that Ethereum has focused a lot on this like store of value, ultrasound money thing, because Ethereum is looking at Big Brother Bitcoin, and there's a lot of emulation that happens in the community, right? And so you want it to be deflationary, and you go out of your way to do something like EIP 1559, which burns some of the fees to try and get to be deflationary, and that strengthens the commodity portion of the valuation.
Yeah.
But I don't think it actually strengthens the money portion of it. The money portion of it, I think, is really about how many people have this thing and how many people are willing to trade for it, right? And so you could have something that like is this ultrasound money, but really, like I think what they're creating is ultrasound commodity.
Yeah.
They're saying it's a deflationary commodity, but it's not money if more people don't have it. And like $50 transaction fees just price out most of the people in the world. They just can't use that. So I think the moneyness is really a function of how many people own the asset.
Yeah. That was, I mean, my second question. I got asked, like, I mean, and Anatoly's specifically spoken to this, like, show me the flag where I can like tag Solana as money. It's just like not possible in an engineering sense to encode is this money into the software. And I think you speak to it very eloquently. And it's ultimately about how many people are using this asset. And I think more broadly, and we were even talking slightly before we started recording about how few people or even addresses use blockchains today. And I think getting to that scale is really what we need to see for the industry to move forward.
I agree with that. And my view now, and I've talked about this with some of the portfolio companies that we're invested in, and I've talked about it elsewhere as well, is just I think we need to get more people interacting with blockchains without having to onboard their own money on chain. Right? Because onboarding your own money on chain is hard. You have to go create an account somewhere, Binance, Coinbase, et cetera, right? Like you have to go send the money in, then you have to redeem the money from the exchange on chain, and then you can do stuff. And we're on the order of like 100 million people in the world who've done this. And I think we may have tapped that out. Like there may be no more people left who are willing to go through that process. And the next wave of users is going to come from people who don't go through that process. They get paid on chain. So they do something useful to get paid on chain, whether that's, drive around with HiveMapper or help create a telecom network with Helium, or use Teleport, which is like Web3 Uber, or use Render to rent out your GPU in order to help train AI models or generate images. Or use, get paid for doing something else, right? Like one of the things we invest in is like a Web3 OnlyFans, right? So you get paid for creating some content. Or you get paid as a tip or international remittances or something like that, right? And I think that's the next wave of users that comes on. And then I think those users will use other things on chain, like especially DeFi or financial services, not because like they care about liquidity mining rewards or because they care about the decentralization or they even understand what any of that stuff means. They're going to use it because it's like the easiest thing to use and it's the cheapest and fastest. And it's just, oh, I don't have to sign up for an account or do anything. I just go and I do the swap. Yeah. And like, I'm done. Yeah. All right. And I don't have to think anymore beyond that. So I'm really focused on finding the protocols or the products that get more people interacting with the chain without onboarding any capital on chain specifically.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's the hardest part in crypto today is exactly as you mentioned, just onboarding people into the ecosystem. It's kind of like the on-ramps are these ports, but once you get into the OpenSea, there's a lot of innovation and you can do kind of unique things that were not previously possible kind of once you get into this like open sea, but to get there, it's relatively difficult. I think particularly, I mean, you touched upon quite a few of the decentralized physical infrastructure stuff. And I would say Multicoin was also very early in communicating kind of some of its bullishness on this arena. Specifically, I mean, the category as in itself, I think you were quite early. Could you speak to maybe just the category as a whole, and then particularly whether it's like Hivemapper, Helium, Render, what about each of those gets you excited? Is it just, as you mentioned earlier, the fact that being able to get people into the chain, and this is one avenue to kind of sidestep, I guess, the onboarding process that can be rather difficult?
Actually, that was like a subsequent realization. That wasn't what got us originally interested. What got us originally interested in this thesis, this proof of physical work or decentralized physical infrastructure networks thesis, was that it was a new method of capital formation, right? And in order to explain why that's exciting, I want to go back to like hundreds of years ago, all right? Think like before the invention of the idea of an LLC, what was capital formation like? Well, all business was like a general partnership, basically. So you only did business with your family, right? Like because bonds of blood would tie you together and you could trust them, right? And like you had the big banking families and things like that. And you couldn't really incentivize employees with equity, because that wasn't a concept that made sense. There wouldn't be any liquidity for it anyway. So there was this like just lack of this tool that you could use to create bigger businesses. And so businesses could only get so big because the communication media or the coordination media was limited. But then around the time of the printing press, we also came up with this idea of limited liability corporations and joint stock corporations and stock exchanges. And now you could reward an executive or an employee with actual ownership in the entity that was limited liability, that was tradable for money. And if things went well, you could incentivize everyone and align everyone together. And this enabled a lot more capital formation. A lot more businesses were created. A lot more wealth was generated through this mechanism. And I think we are at that next step now, where we have the new communication technology is the internet, and what we need is the new coordination mechanism that's internet native. And that's where I think these crypto native organizations are the most interesting, because they allow people to coordinate together to do something that they cannot do in the old network, right? So just like it was impossible to give, people in the 1400s equity in your, new shipping company or something, it was just like the infrastructure wasn't there. Like 10 years ago, when you start Uber, like you could not give all of the Uber drivers equity in Uber. Like the infrastructure does not exist. You couldn't give all the Airbnb hosts equity in Airbnb. Or, a really good example is like Waze. Waze is like created by the people who are putting in the data, and they couldn't give those people any ownership. And when Waze sold for $1 billion, like those map editors got like a t-shirt. Yeah. Right. So I think that we have this next technology now that enables people to coordinate together to create businesses that serve a consumer need. And that coordination was not previously possible. And I think the first instantiations of that are things like Helium or Hivemapper that touch the physical world, because the demand is clear, right? Like, that telecommunications is something that's useful. You need to build the supply side, and there's a demand on that marketplace, right? That maps are a useful thing. And if we could have fresher maps, like there's demand there, but you just need to coordinate to build that. But those are like the first examples. And then there will be more things that are built on top of the economic models and the foundations that are laid by the first.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think you put it beautifully. I think the other question that people ask me more frequently now that we're kind of in a downturn within crypto is what are the real world use cases? And people can often just point to stablecoins. But I think the new thing that kind of is now coming to everybody's mind is these real world infrastructure that are incentivized by tokens. And they can very clearly see, as you mentioned, this is actually providing real world value that I can tangibly see, and it's getting better and it's enabled through crypto rails. So no, kudos again to Multicoin team for spotting this early.
Yeah, one other thing that I think is really interesting about these physical infrastructure networks is this concept of productive bubbles. So this idea comes from, at least where I got it from, is there's this book by this professor, Carlota Perez, called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. And it talks about this concept of productive bubbles, where you have a bubble, a financial bubble, and that incentivizes the creation of some real world infrastructure that is valuable even after the bubble has popped. So the classic example of this that she outlines in the book is telecom in the late 90s, right? Like we had the dot-com boom. Along the dot-com boom, we had a telecom boom, and tons of fiber was laid, all this infrastructure was created, and that infrastructure ended up not necessarily being financially the most attractive investment for the people who bought the top, but it ended up creating a ton of value later on because it was already there, and now you could come up with new use cases for it. And so that's another idea that I've thought about quite a bit in relation to crypto, because crypto is like prone to this boom and bust cycle, right? Like we have like the true animal spirits of the free market exist in crypto in a way that they don't exist in other markets anymore. And so you're going to have this boom and bust. So what can most productively take advantage of the boom and bust cycle? And I think it's these physical infrastructure networks, because in the boom cycle, you'll build a ton of infrastructure. You'll deploy like 1 million helium hotspots, you'll get 1 million Hivemapper dash cams or whatever other thing. And then in the bust cycle, those things are still useful. They're still creating value. And then the next boom cycle, you'll deploy another 10x or so on and so forth. And then until you've achieved the scale that you need. So harnessing the power of like crypto bubbles and the animal spirits of crypto markets in order to create the most useful products out of it, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, no, the cyclical nature of crypto definitely makes things a little bit of a challenge, just from a variety of reasons. But I do think bringing people in, kind of laying that infrastructure, whether it's in the real world, as you mentioned, on kind of the distributed physical infrastructure, or even just like the core networks. One thing that I hear quite a bit is, all right, we don't need to scale blockchains anymore. Blockspace is empty. And then I often go back to what you referenced in the early 90s, like, yes, like ultimately the infrastructure that was laid at that point in time was not used, but that does not mean we will not need it in the future and we should continue or stop building today.
Oh, I agree with that completely. The people who are saying Blockspace is empty, like why do we need to scale, are the people who in the 90s would have been saying like, why do you need more than dial-up?
Yeah.
Right? Like, or it's that famous Paul Krugman quote of like, the internet will be a fad when people realize that they just don't have that much to say to each other.
Yeah.
Right? No, human demand is insatiable, and it's infinite, boundless, and we will always want more things.
I fully agree. Maybe on that kind of topic, one kind of way that people are thinking about scaling today is layer twos. I think you and I have very similar approaches to kind of how we think about them today, but could you share a little bit more about layer twos, how you particularly are thinking about them, And are they going to be useful for scaling?
Define useful.
or maybe just broadly speak to L2s, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah. I have a couple of thoughts here. One is just, I feel like when you're operating with all these constraints and this like technical debt and this baggage, and you have to like find a scaling solution that fits within that, it's really difficult. You have to like, twist yourself in a pretzel in order to like get the logical answer that you want, right? This is the same thing that the Bitcoin community did with Lightning, where it's like, okay, well, these are the constraints that must not be violated. We are unwilling to change these things because that's how they were in the past and that's how they must always be in the future. And so now what can we do? And they came up with Lightning, and like Lightning doesn't work, right? It's been years and years and years, and like there's just no sign of actual commercial adoption for it because it's too confusing and hard, and the developer experience is really hard. The user experience is really hard. And I think that like Ethereum is going down that same road because they're not solving the core of the scaling problem, right? Like what you want is you want to have the ability to compose state across many different types of applications in a way that's simple for the end user. How am I as a user going to know I'm on Arbitrum chain number 45 versus Polygon ZK rollup number 10 or Optimism, rollup number 5, right? Like I don't know that. And then liquidity is fragmented across all of these. And actually, if liquidity is fragmented, now you've created a ton more arbitrage transactions, which then consume more block space and mean that you need to then, like you're back at square one. Like what have you actually solved with this? And you've created all this complexity along the way. I think that for some use cases that don't require composability, layer 2s are interesting, right? Like you're building a game. It can be in its own self-contained layer 2, and then you can require people to bridge out to do stuff. Like that seems fine. But if you're trying to build something that really leverages composability, then I think layer 2s don't really work for that purpose. And then let's talk about the layer 2 tokens themselves.
Let's do it.
Right? Because I question why they exist. Like, why do you need a token at all? Like, an Arbitrum token or an Optimism token, right? Let's go back to that framework that I use for how these types of assets are valued. Commodity, like, do you need the asset to pay transaction fees? Currently, the answer is no, you don't. You pay the fees in ETH, right? So the commodity value of this asset is 0. Do you need to stake the asset in order to be the validator and earn MEV? No. You don't. There's a centralized sequencer. You don't get to choose who that is. It's just some company that is a centralized sequencer. So you don't get that either, right? And then 3 is the moneyness. How many people can use it, right? How many people will own this asset? Well, when your layer 2 tops out at like, on the order of 10 to 50 transactions per second, or even like 100 transactions per second, how many people can use it? How many people have you priced out of using it even with dollar transaction fees, right? So I think the moneyness aspect is also quite low. So I don't actually understand why these tokens exist. And one of the things that I think we're going to see over the next 18 to 24 months is the market wrestle with this question, especially with the emergence of this idea that Eigenlayer came up with, which is secure the L2 with staked ETH, not with some new asset that's created. And so I think what we're going to see is like the Ethereum community is going to say, actually, the truly Ethereum aligned L2s use staked ETH as their security mechanism, not some new token that doesn't have these other value propositions and is therefore not providing as much security as it could.
Yeah, no, all good examples. I have a lot of respect for Shahram and the Eigenlayer team. I think what they've been doing in kind of the restaking is pretty interesting. But on the topics of layer 2s and composability, to me, it seemed like composability was the magic sauce that made blockchains. Because, I mean, going back, really if you have like a bunch of sharded blockchains or sharded ecosystems, really that's kind of recreating the banking world that we have today. These like individual silos, you're trying to like kind of like patch them together and then do something interesting with them. But the magic truly in blockchains was there are no walls. Programmers and users ultimately don't have to interface with those walls, and you can do interesting things because all the information lives together. And the more that I personally kind of dug into layer twos, I think for 99% of the use cases that people think today, they're not going to really manifest them how people think they are going to long term. And composability is going to be that like key thing that I think is hard today to really see because there's not very many applications, there's not very many users, but over time it'll become more apparent that composability is this thing and it should be preserved at a very high cost.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also as a corollary there, right? Think about what happens when you break composability, right? The system as a whole will always come down to the throughput and the latency of the lowest common denominator, like the connecting fabric.
Yeah.
Right. So whether that's I'm going to sell back down to the L1 and then up into another L2, or I'm going to use some sort of bridge or something, right? Like something in this system is going to hit capacity. And that is going to be the rate limiter for the whole system.
Could you explain this a little bit more? Because for me personally, it took me probably a year to understand all this, but could you explain just like that throughput capacity? Because I feel like a lot of blockchains ultimately boil down to this, as you mentioned, but the nuance people just don't understand.
Yeah. So let's think of an analogy, right? I saw a really good one on Twitter the other day. Think of a shopping mall, right? With something like Ethereum, right? What you have is you have 1,000 shops in the shopping mall, but there's only one checkout line. And there's one cashier at a time, and they can only check out one person at a time. So you have to wait in line, and if you pay more, you get to cut the line, right? And so what can you do to make that system faster? You can make the cashiers go faster, but there's only so fast a cashier can go. And the cashier in this case is like a CPU or some sort of processor. And what we have found is that like Moore's law has broken down for single-threaded computing. We're not getting much faster at single-threaded computing. All of the gains in the past decade or so have come from parallelization, right? Then the next analogy that I would draw in the same way is something like Solana, where each store has its own checkout line. So just because there's a huge line at one store doesn't mean that the next store has a huge line. And so this is just like really simple and easy to follow. And then the world with layer twos is one where each store has its own checkout line, but in order to go from store to store, you have to wait in one giant line. Because the fabric that connects these different stores becomes the limiting factor, right? So you want to go from store A to store B, well then get in line and wait until you can get into store B.
Yeah.
And so you're just moving the lines, the queues to different places in the system. And that's the rate limiter.
Whether that's like, say, a decentralized sequencer, or when you, with a layer 2 example, settle the layer 2 back down to the layer 1 and then trying to go to another layer 2.
Correct. Or if you're using a bridge, right? Like there's going to be a handful of ways to go from one store to another store in this L2 world, but they're going to all be limited by some amount. And you can't have an infinite number of bridges because then all your block space is taken up by bridges.
Yeah.
and like what are we doing here? It just gets very circular.
Yeah. To me, it is kind of a little comical. I think I always say like all these blockchains will work. It's just like at the end of the day, what you're optimizing for. And I think when you're kind of Frankensteining, or as you mentioned earlier, kind of making a pretzel fit into like a tiny area, it kind of starts to look more like Frankenstein. And if you were to redesign it, in my personal opinion, it would be one of these like high throughput single shard type ecosystems where one, it's just easier for engineers because they don't have to worry about deploying applications in multiple places. But then two, it's also just much easier on the user standpoint. And to your point, you're really bottlenecked by the slowest piece in that. And I think you can paralyze quite a bit of that in just like a single shard. And if you can do that, what's the purpose of at least majority of kind of layer twos and what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah. And I think one key thing that everyone needs to understand is just like, actually, there aren't that many users in Web3 yet, right? There's just not that much that is real world useful today. Yep. And what that means is it's impossible to say that something is won. No one's won yet. Yeah. Because like, we're just sitting here with a few million people using this stuff. And that's just such a small percentage of humanity. We're talking 10 bips of all the people in the world have used this stuff, like actually used it, maybe a little less. Right. And so it's impossible to say that something is won. Right. So I do think we have the opportunity to start from first principles and design the right system from the ground up. And we're not beholden to the tech debt as an industry. We don't have to be backwards facing. We don't have to redesign the airplane mid-flight and hope that we get, we can change out the propeller for a jet, right? It's better to just design the jet from first principles and we can take off.
Yeah. Nope. I fully agree. I think people often overestimate the network effects of some of these earlier networks. But yeah, the amount of users is very, very small. And I think every blockchain, even Solana included, is kind of at the starting line. And even if you have a Ferrari, you can't teleport to 200 miles per hour. You have to kind of slowly build there. And so I think to that point, there's different cars at the starting line. Some of them may be sports cars, but we're still all on the starting line. I think maybe just sticking on the Solana topic a little bit longer, they've been announcing quite a few interesting kind of technologies, either from like the Solana mobile phone. I have one. Don't want to grab it. Maybe. The Solana mobile phone or compression, or even with Backpack and XNFTs recently. Ultimately, I say Mad Lads is kind of the Trojan horse for Backpack, but maybe speaking to any specific one of those and what kind of has caught your eye or what you're excited about in the Solana ecosystem today, because I feel like, maybe I spend too much time on Twitter, but the momentum feels different than it has recently. And so personally, it's just kind of fun to be in the Solana ecosystem again.
Yeah, it really does feel like it's turned a corner, right? Because I think the biggest thing that people are realizing is that it's not going away, right? Like there were a lot of people who called me in December. They were like, hey man, this thing's going to zero. It's over. Like you were wrong. And it's just over. Everyone's going to leave, right? And people still through Q1 were like, is it over? Is it going to die? Are the people going to leave? And now it's become like really obvious to everyone that like the people are not leaving, right? And this reminds me of Ethereum in 2018, actually. When people saw ETH go from $1,400 to $88 at the low.
I was part of that crew.
Yeah, I rode that, right? I rode that entire wave. And I remember like everyone was questioning Ethereum. And they were like, is this going to be a thing? Are the people going to leave? And actually shared hardship brings a community together.
Fully agree.
There's nothing like shared hardship to help tie people together and build those relationships and connections. And we just went through a trial by fire moment for the Solana community. And I think we are now seeing the green shoots out of that fire that are really exciting. And, that's things like Mad Lads, the Mint showed that state hotspots and priority fees being isolated to a specific piece of state works. So in that analogy I was talking about earlier about having, different checkout lines at every store in the shopping mall, this showed that even though there was a huge line for one store, the fees for the other stores or the lines for the other stores did not go up. And like, that's really cool to see in production actually working at scale. It's been theorized for a while and tested, but like tests are not the real world. You have to see it work in the real world, and that just happened, right? And then I think the second thing is we're seeing this decentralized physical infrastructure networks like coalesce around Solana. So Helium moved over, they minted 1 million NFTs, right? And imagine how much it would cost to mint 1 million NFTs on another network. Like, you couldn't really do it economically. No. They brought in all of those users who are now using other things. HiveMapper has been growing. I think they've mapped something like 3% of all of the roads in the world. Crazy. They started 4 months ago.
Crazy.
And they're mapping areas that like Google doesn't have.
Yeah.
Like, Google literally just doesn't have them on the map. That's happening. We're seeing Teleport. We saw Render Vote to move over, right? So it's becoming this like hub for these networks that touch the real world, which I think is really appealing to a lot of people because that gives them state to compose with, right? Now I can build tools for all of the people who are using the HiveMapper data for some purpose, or I can build tools for the people who are, going to use Teleport and Uber and like analyze, the various transactions that they're making, right? These give you the anchor points for composability to be valuable.
Yeah, no, there's just been a flurry of activity, and like you mentioned, with all kind of the distributed physical projects moving over to Solana, I think one is just kind of outside of composability, just a nod to the network that these things particularly are, well, they're all hard to do. And if you're on kind of a lower throughput network, have even higher latency or even just like marginally higher gas prices, that affects what they're trying to build. I actually did a podcast with HiveMapper and Ariel, and he was like, look, we didn't build on Ethereum because the number of transactions that we have already submitted to the network would have bankrupt us. We purely just chose Solana because they have high throughput, they are decentralized, and these transactions are cheap. And at the end of the day, users are not going to ask us when we pay them, which blockchain is this on? They just want the money or being able to kind of have that ownership stake in building out some of these networks. And so, no, it's just been fun to be on Solana again. I think we definitely went through a very heated period, which was painful. But yeah, coming out on the other side, and now kind of with the exclamation of Backpack and Mad Lads being the top NFT collection in all of crypto, it's exciting.
Yeah, I think one other thing I want to add to the developer experience here is just the stability of it, right? It's not shifting under your feet in terms of, well, the scaling strategy was going to be optimistic rollups, but now it's ZK rollups. And so you better learn how to code, a ZK circuit in to your system.
It's not L2s, now it's L3s.
Yeah. And like, if you are just building for the crypto market, maybe you're willing to suffer that complexity, right? And you're willing to say, I'll shift along with that narrative and I'll go from L2s to L3s to L4s or, optimistic to ZK or so on and so forth and keep shifting with it. But if you're building a real business that touches non-crypto people, which is the vast majority of people in the world, the vast, vast, vast majority of people in the world, you just want stability. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to have to shift. You want to deploy and then focus on the actual business problem you're solving. Like HiveMapper, I don't think wants to think about the chain. They don't want to think about the scaling. They don't want to think about how they're going to have to change as, this type of rollup changes to become that type of rollup or anything like that. They want to focus on like, how do we get the most useful map data possible? And that's it.
Yeah. I appreciate that Solana and high throughput networks ultimately abstract the infrastructure such that application engineers can focus on building products. And it's just super refreshing, I think, to talk with engineers and product builders and founders that are focused on products and using products on chain instead of scaling for the sake of scaling, or that they have to focus on things because of the limitations of the network.
Yeah, it's what do you start with, right? Like as a developer or as an entrepreneur, like what do you start with? What is your North Star? And like one of my filters actually that I look for in investments is I want the entrepreneur's North Star to be some commercial objective, not to satisfy some ideological desire to do something, or not to be a part of some community or build within some community. I want a commercial objective, some good or service that they're going to provide to the world that is useful, that people are willing to pay money for, and then you backfill the rest, right? Like everything else is secondary in service of that main goal. But if your main goal is just, I want to build decentralized social media, well, why? Like, what is the commercial objective there? Or is it you're doing it for ideological reasons? If you're doing it just for ideological reasons, like I think that's the wrong North Star to focus on.
Yeah. Maybe switching a little bit, you and Kyle and Multicoin often have been unabashedly early to a lot of these different technologies. And when you approach them initially, the firm or even you individually get lots of FUD. I think going back to earlier in the podcast, I have been continuously just impressed by the work that you guys put out on your blog posts. And then sometimes it doesn't always make sense, but then I think it has more often than not kind of manifested itself. Can you talk specifically to how you personally just kind of deal with kind of the FUD from outside of the community, or even sometimes feeling like perhaps a black sheep inside of the crypto community?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's only one way to earn excess returns in this world. You have to be contrarian and you have to be right. If you are with the herd and you're right, you earned average returns, right? Like, go buy an index. What are you doing? Why do you deserve to manage anyone's money, right? If you're contrarian and you're wrong, well, you're going to underperform, and like that's a bad outcome. And if you're with the herd and you're wrong, well, that's probably the worst outcome, although there is safety in numbers there. So if you underwrite to the fact that like the only way to make excess returns is to be contrarian and be right, well, contrarians are always in the minority. They have to be. By definition, you have to be in the minority. And you have to be willing to pay the cost of it. Like one of my big lessons that I learned, there was a mentor of mine when I was younger, and he told me, figure out what success means to you, figure out what the cost is that you need to pay for that success, and then pay the cost, right? And it sounds so simple, but like this is the cost of being contrarian, is you have to be willing to take the FUD, right? Like you have to be willing to take the negative emotions, because you're telling people you are wrong.
Yeah.
And you are taking the minority view. You're explicitly going against the majority. So like you can't walk into that like expecting them to agree with you and be like, oh yes, you're right, right? Like it's going to take time. And the only way that you will know that you are right is when the market speaks, because in the short run, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine, right? So right now people might vote and they're like, they're commenting on your tweets or whatever. And like there's just a lot of disagreement or negativity, and people can be pretty mean on the internet. But that's just the cost you have to pay if you want to be contrarian.
Yeah. I used to swim in college, and my coaches would often tell me, how bad do you want it? Do you really want it? And I think that's similar to what is the price, and pay that price. But it definitely doesn't make it, I guess, any easier just emotionally. I think I've slowly been going through this myself. I've been told I'm not very fun at parties because I'll just pick apart people's arguments. But no, I think, I mean, you're totally spot on with the only way to provide excess returns is to be contrarian and right. And I think you have to be able to swallow the pill that you're maybe not going to be the most popular person at party at sometimes. And that's just comes with the job that we do.
Exactly. That's the price you have to pay, right? Like, if you want to win the popularity contest, if you want to be a politician, right? Like, go with the herd. Your job as a politician is to go find what the median voter believes and then express that view. And that's how you get the most people to like you. But that's not the job of a professional investor. Like, our success is not determined by how many people like us. That's not the metric that actually matters. So, you got to figure out, like, what is the job that you're trying to do?
True. Yeah. Sometimes we can get lost by the popularity contest that happens on Twitter, but staying grounded and remembering ultimately, I mean, the space is small, and whether it's Solana or any of these ecosystems, like, we all, I think, are aligned in growing that pie. And I think we have different views on, the industry has different views on how we achieve those, but ultimately it's pushing the entire space forward. Maybe kind of wrapping up the podcast, I heard that you particularly in Multicoin have been thinking more on, like, along the lines of AI or just the vectors of that progress that either crypto has been pushing forward or AI has been pushing forward. Can you speak a little bit to how you're thinking about the AI space?
Yeah, I think what we're witnessing with AI is probably the biggest paradigm shift in computing that I've ever seen. Maybe the biggest one ever, right? And so it opens up a ton of design space for how the future of computing will evolve. Because when you have this type of paradigm shift, it's very chaotic, and it becomes harder to extrapolate past trends into the future. Everything can change now, right? So I think in those types of periods, it's useful to think about, like, what will not change? What do we know for sure, right? The first thing that we know for sure is that AI is going to increase demand for compute on the order of 100x to 1000x, right? Because this stuff is very compute intensive. There's obvious utility to AI. There's no question of product market fit here. And we know that we're going to need 100 to 1000x more compute in the entire world, maybe even 10,000x. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And then what else do we know? We know that we have huge supply chain problems with semiconductors. We're trying to re-onshore the supply chain there. That is a decade-long project. That's just not going to happen really fast. And we know that that's where all of the investment is going. And so people aren't, these big companies aren't investing in, like, huge new fabs in Taiwan. They want to build them in Texas or Arizona or Oregon, right? That's just going to take some time before we can ramp up the production capacity of semiconductors. And then we have the US government waging basically a trade war against China around semiconductors to prevent them from getting to scale on the most advanced chips, which is also going to reduce the amount of chips that we as a civilization, as humanity as a whole, can produce. All right? So let's put that together. We have dramatic increase in demand, like the biggest increase that we've seen in our lives.
Yeah.
And we have very limited ability to increase supply. So what does that mean? It means that the marginal utility of the idle assets goes up, right? So I used to think that, like, decentralized cloud was not that interesting. Like in 2017, 2018, there were a lot of people working on it. And at least personally, I wasn't that interested because I was like, well, AWS works, right? It's good enough. And maybe you can get a cost advantage with decentralization and idle hardware, but the redundancy requirement for decentralization eats away that cost advantage. So it's not worth it. But now it's different. You cannot get GPUs on AWS. You can't get GPUs on Google Cloud or Azure. Like, they're just not available. So it's not good enough anymore. And so now using something like Render Network, which we're investors in, to go and access a decentralized cloud of GPUs, or use something like Filecoin to access a decentralized cloud of other types of services, I think becomes more interesting and valuable because the centralized providers are just not able to meet that demand anymore.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of, I have a GPU that I haven't been using for the last 7 months. Definitely quite a bit of idle compute out there that I'm sure could be put to good use.
Exactly. And we need it, right? Because the demand will be there. So the economic case is there. The next thing that I think is really interesting at the intersection of AI and crypto is reinforcement learning with human feedback and token incentives. So to take a step back and explain what that means, here's how these AI models all work at a very, very high level. The way they work is you spin up a neural net and you make 10 million copies of it, right? And then you give that model a test. And then the ones that fail the test, you kill. And the ones that survive the test, you mutate and you create the next version of the model and you give it a harder test. And you do this, however many, trillions and trillions of times. And ultimately you end up with like a ChatGPT type model, right? Because it's just passed every single linguistic test that you can throw at it in terms of predicting the next word in the sentence. But this only works if you have the test to give, right? Like these models aren't going to learn on their own. Like you have to have the data to teach them. You have to have the test to give them. And at this point, I think something like, OpenAI has crawled the entire public internet. Like all of the data that is out there that is available to be used, I believe has probably been used. I don't know for sure, but I think it has been used, right? Like they have 10 trillion data points in that model, right? Something like that. So we've used all of it. So how do they get better from here, right? It seems unlikely that the next step of AI evolution will come from using like publicly available data. I think the next step will come from humans deliberately training the models in order to get them to be smarter. And so, think like designers looking at the output of like a Figma AI and saying, this makes sense, this doesn't, and telling it why so it can learn, right? Or think of lawyers looking at contracts that are spit out by AI and saying, this makes sense and this doesn't, or this is how this works. Or architects or bookkeepers or, all these other professions. And they are going to want to own a piece of that model. They're going to want to own a piece of the upside. And so now this goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of this using tokens as like a new coordination technology to allow people to work together that couldn't have otherwise organized to work together. So I think having, a worldwide group of architects or designers or lawyers or accountants or, whatever else work together to train these models and get ownership in those models is like a really interesting application of tokens as a new way to have capital formation. And the capital formation, like the end capital asset that you're creating through this coordination, is a smarter model that can now do more stuff. It can automate away more human labor such that we can all be wealthier, right? Like we as a society have to do less work to get the same output.
I like it. You can see how the pieces are starting to kind of come together with AI, with crypto, the decentralized compute, with being able to train large neural networks with the amount of data, how the token incentives that we talked about earlier with the real world kind of distributed physical infrastructure can allow this. No, it's fascinating.
Yeah. There's one more piece that I think is interesting that where crypto and AI intersect, which is just deepfakes.
Yeah.
Right. We're going to see so much.
Yeah. It's actually already so bad. I mean, I see stuff on the timeline and it's, it's fake, but you can see the progress and you're like, man, this in a couple years time, or even a year, it's going to be pretty hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not.
Yeah. And the only thing that I can think of that solves that is signing things that are real with cryptographic keys.
Yeah.
And, showing like, hey, unless it's signed by this key, it's not authentic.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, I actually imagine all political campaigns will have that, and they'll say, at the end of political campaigns now, they're like, this message was approved by so-and-so, right? And like, that's the authentication, but it's just like a guy's voice or a woman's voice saying so. Not very secure
No.
at all. Very easy for AI to imitate. But if you have to sign that with a key, well, now the AI won't be able to emulate it, and you can make sure that like the message is true. And where is that register of keys and maps to identities going to live? I think it's going to live on a public blockchain, because you don't want to have a gatekeeper for authenticity, where only if you meet this gatekeeper's requirements can you prove that you are real, or that you're posting authentic content. So I think it has to be this kind of permissionless thing. So we'll see how that evolves, but that has, I think, a lot of potential to bring in new users over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because they want to prove that like this was real.
Yeah, I fully agree on that as well. Well, thank you so much, Tushar. Super fun conversation. Maybe last thing, whether it's this year, next year, or in a couple years, is there anything particular that you're just excited about the space, or things that you would like to kind of see happen, things that you would like to have happen and have those happen faster?
What I would like to see happen faster. The one big tipping point that I'm really excited about is when more people own crypto than own equities in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that'll happen within the time frame that you mentioned. And the reason why I think that's really valuable is like that increases the moneyness of these assets, because moneyness is all about coincidence of wants, and it's all about people recognizing that something is valuable. And so if you have more owners of it, I think that really helps. And we're close. We have like 100 million-ish people who own crypto. Mm-hmm. Like, we just need to 5x that. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Well, thank you again, Tushar. Wonderful conversation. Glad we were able to do this in person. Again, I have a lot of respect for what you and Kyle built at Multicoin. Being early, being contrarian, it's not easy. And ultimately, the hardest part is kind of being correct on that thesis, and putting all those together. It's a challenge. So appreciate all the work that you've done in the space, and thank you again for chatting with me here on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.